Everybody or anybody who has listened to the news at any point in the last, whatever month this is, December to July, 5 months, has heard something about a guy named Jeffrey Epstein. This man right here. So he was, some background information on him. 2008 he was arrested, tried, and convicted on different charges, which in turn made him have to register as a sex offender, which was all done in the state of Florida. But before he got there, there's a little more background information on him. So he was born in New York. He was a financier. Before he opened up, before he started getting in the world of finance, he was a teacher for a couple of years at a prestigious K-12 school in New York. After he left that job, he took another job at Bear Stearns, where he worked for a couple of years, and he left there in the early 80s and set up the Epstein and Company in 1982, which was a finance firm. So he ran that from St. Thomas Islands and the U.S. Virgin Islands for tax purposes. And he only had one client when he was working there, and that was Les Wexner, the owner of Victoria's Secret. And this guy, Wexner, had purchased a mansion for him in Manhattan. And Jeffrey Epstein gained public recognition from his Jeffrey Epstein the Sixth Foundation, which he donated multi-million dollars to places such as Harvard. And another thing that people have heard is he's been known to travel with elites around the United States, from logs on his plane to have included Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey in one flight. So pass it on.
There are a number of suspicious events that occurred on the night of Jeffrey Epstein's death, and one of the first things that may or may not have been typical to the holding facility was that there were 2 prison guards assigned to Mr. Epstein's hallway that didn't meet their obligations of their duties. Of these guards, one of them was not hired for the position full-time, but rather was just filling in. The other guard, although full-time and permanent, was found lacking as well. Each of the guards was supposed to make rounds and check on the inmates every 30 minutes. These 2 guards didn't complete the tasks they were assigned. Instead, they were found asleep or browsing the internet doing online shopping. Because these guards were found to be lacking in their duties, they then attempted, after the fact, to falsify documents to say that they really had in fact completed their rounds. There was also a shortage of experienced full-time workers in the jail facility where Jeffrey Epstein was being held. In any detention facility, necessary oversight and attention to detail is essential for inmates to be guarded effectively. The safety of Mr. Epstein and any other inmate of that matter would be greatly compromised with temporary staff and full-time staff that didn't do what they were assigned to do. Perhaps Mr. Epstein was sent to this particular facility because it was notorious for being short-staffed. Another mysterious factor in this case is that the 3 cameras set up in the hallway outside of Mr. Epstein's cell were not functioning properly. 2 of the cameras had malfunctioned and were not working at all. And the last camera that could have captured footage of people with access to Jeffrey Epstein's cell was later found to be faulty with no justified reason as to why the footage was unusable. Was it merely coincidence that this hardware broke down at the same time as Mr. Epstein's alleged suicide, or was it in fact perfect timing for those who wanted to do him harm?
Once we start to really think about these almost unnatural circumstances that surrounded Jeffrey Epstein's death, it almost starts to raise more questions than it answers. Raise these questions being, did he really do it? Did Jeffrey Epstein commit suicide? Or did something more sinister take place that night? And perhaps we were simply coerced into believing that it was something as trivial as a suicide. The New York Times officially published that Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in cardiac arrest around 6:30 a.m. in his cell on August 10th of 2019. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner, after his autopsy, officially declared Epstein's cause of death as a self-inflicted hanging, that he had used a bedsheet that he'd taken from his bed in his cell. After that, not much information surfaced, so it was essentially case closed, so to speak. That was until the Epstein family, who was quite unhappy with this ruling of a suicide, hired a renowned pathologist named Michael Baden. Michael Baden had personally observed the autopsy of Epstein, and he informed the Epstein family that during the autopsy he noticed significant bruising in Epstein's wrists as well as his forearms. He also observed that he had broken his hyoid bone. For those of you unfamiliar with your human anatomy, the hyoid bone is located in your throat, right around your Adam's apple. And it's quite uncommon for elderly males to break that bone when they hang themselves via suicide. But the Washington Post published that it is extremely common in homicide via strangulation to have that bone be broken. That, along with Epstein having significant bruising in his arms, suggests that he most likely was restrained and probably fought off his attacker as he was being strangled to death. That, with the absent guards, faulty security cameras, bruising in his arms, broken hyoid bone, definitely a spotty past, to say the least, it creates quite the string of perfect circumstances surrounding a supposed suicide. Once we start to scratch the surface at how Epstein had died that night, it really starts to ask, why? Why kill this financer turned sex trafficker? Who would have the motive? Without a decisive decision on whether or not he had committed suicide or he was murdered, the who really remains quite vague. We can only speculate on who it could be. Perhaps it was a former victim of his sex trafficking who simply wanted revenge. Another theory states that perhaps Epstein had a partner who simply wanted him dead to keep his mouth shut. Interestingly enough, Epstein claimed to have valuable knowledge of compromising information on famous individuals, in particularly the Clintons. Suffice it to say, the evidence overwhelmingly points towards homicide, or at the very least, definitely raises some questions about the true fate of Jeffrey Epstein on his final night.
So you may wonder, why would you want Jeffrey Epstein's death? You would think his victims would want him to stand trial to be justly accused for the crimes he committed. But then you have to think, does this man who has nothing to lose have information on other very powerful people that could potentially damage their reputation? No, Epstein is notably friends with people like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, and Prince Andrew. However, Bill Clinton may be the guy with the most to lose. Epstein and Clinton were friends for a long time, dating back at least to the 1990s, back when Bill Clinton was the president. And so to say that Clinton was on Epstein's plane many times. However, in the report released, Clinton claims it was only on it 4 times, but the plane log said it was about 27 times. Now, why would you have that big of a difference between one person's estimation and the actual number on the plane logs? One could only suggest that Clinton and Epstein were connected much more than people realize, and Clinton wanted to do all he could to hide the fact that he knew exactly what Epstein was doing, and that Epstein knew exactly what Clinton did during his time in office, during the sexual scandal that led to his impeachment and near removal from office. And to top things off, Clinton has also been connected to the deaths of other people while he was in office. Nothing ever resulted in legal issues, but there are all signs that point to Clinton being behind the deaths of many people. And with Epstein having nothing to lose, if he's found guilty, he's already spending life in prison. Why not bring down some of his other friends with him, so they would have justice served to them as well. This is why Bill Clinton would be a perfect candidate to want Jeffrey Epstein dead.
So just to wrap it up really quick, before anyone puts their tinfoil hats on, when you do hear maybe this guy was killed in a maximum security prison, it's pretty go live under a rock, prepare for the apocalypse conspiracy theory, but there are facts that have been presented that haven't quite been answered yet that could give us a better understanding of what exactly happened that night.